Chapter 6. Sarah was quite put out. She picked up her journal and began to write. The senator has been most irritating. Then she threw her pen across the room and stamped her foot on the floor. She went to her window and stared at the street. She would have gone out, but it was one of those drizzling and foggy days typical of the city. She rang for her maid. The maid took an ungodly long time responding. Sarah wished she could own slaves as they did in the South. Perhaps, she thought, she would move to Louisiana if the rebels were to win this silly war. Took you long enough, she said when Vera finally showed up. I must have rung for you half an hour ago. Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am. Actually, it had been more like 5 minutes. Sarah picked up her copy of the day's bulletin. Have you seen the front page today? This is ridiculous. I refer, of course, to this item about the emperor. Well, ma'am, I guess the war news is slow in coming, so they have to print something else. I wasn't asking for your opinion. Sarah was feeling more put out by the minute. She would definitely let Vera go as soon as she could find someone to replace that woman. Well, ma'am, I did see that item. Vera seemed oblivious of just how put out Sarah was. It says the judge wouldn't send Emperor Norton to the madhouse because he never did no harm to no one. The whole city was in an uproar about his being arrested and all. So now the chief of police ordered all the officers to salute the emperor whenever he should pass by. Sarah gave a deep sigh. She did not feel like correcting Vera's grammar today. Vera, if it is not too much trouble, please be so good as to bring me a cup of hot tea and some buttered rolls. I believe I shall go out for a walk later, rain or no rain. Surely, ma'am. Vera gave an awkward curtsy, turned, and departed. Sarah did get out later that day with no particular destination in mind. She thought of strolling up Market Street to peer in shop windows. The drizzle had stopped, but the air was chill. On the way, she noticed a new poster nailed to a fence. Joshua Norton, de Gracia, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico, will lecture one time only this evening, 8 p.m., at the Mechanics Institute on the Economics of Slavery. There was more, but she didn't bother to read all of it. The date was for this evening. Sarah was aware that Norton was sometimes invited to lecture at public functions. From what she'd heard, he sounded quite rational. His subject was usually economics or Roman history. She smiled to herself to think of a bankrupt madman lecturing on economics. No doubt he had his public following, and Sarah had little doubt but what that Mary Ellen woman was somehow involved in this particular event. Why not? She asked herself. She had nothing better to do, and there was a chance she might pick up some clue she missed as to the location of Norton's treasure. So it was that Sarah arrived in a hired buggy promptly at 8 o'clock at the Mechanics Institute. She had been here a few times in the past, either out of boredom or because Senator Sharon had insisted on attending. This evening, the place was as packed as she had ever seen it. She found a seat in the rear and settled in. Sure enough, Mary Ellen gave the introduction. Sarah was grateful, at least for brevity. Then Norton took the podium, looking impressive in his blue uniform and epaulets. He launched at once into his sermon. The institution of slavery has oppressed not only the Negro, but Southern white society. Sarah only half listened, paying more attention to studying the audience. During moments when she did tune in to what Norton was saying, he sounded quite sane, though she wasn't sure she believed him. His idea was that slavery had held back the South economically because all the industrious youth migrated north where they might find training and jobs. Thus, the only shipbuilding port in the South was at Savannah. Why hire expensive trained laborers when one can simply purchase slaves? Of course, slaves didn't know how to build ships, or read for that matter. Sarah shrugged. She supposed the argument was valid, but she found the subject boring. What she found interesting was the manner in which Norton seemed to mesmerize his audience. They hung on his every word. She wondered how he did it. He had some form of charm or an air of authority she did not quite comprehend. Everyone knew the man was supposedly a pauper, and yet he claimed importance. His audience, witnessing his assertion of authority, his self confidence, believed him and awarded him their own confidence. Tomorrow, Norton would be out selling his worthless stock certificates to these same people or trying to pass off his imperial currency. Before the talk was ended, she found the air stuffy and oppressive. She left early. She wondered at Norton's secret and how she might use it. Several days later, a letter appeared in the Alta California. Do not be fooled. The emperor is no pauper, nor is he a madman. Anyone who witnessed his recent speech on economics and slavery at the Mechanics Institute will attest to the latter statement. Emperor Joshua Norton the First has a mind as sound as a dollar. He realizes that should he be exposed as not a lunatic, folks will begin to question what happened to those thousands of dollars he managed to conceal from the bankruptcy court. The mystery remains, where has Emperor Norton hidden his treasure? Signed, respectfully, Socrates. Sarah put down her copy of the paper with some satisfaction. She considered it a good letter. Her pen name of Socrates was a clever stroke, leading readers to assume it was written by a man. She expected the emperor would be furious when he saw it. Perhaps he would compose another of his so-called proclamations. In any event, she thought this might put a crack in his facade. If he were to admit to being sane and rational, then he would be forced to stop his imperial pretense. The alternative would be to claim insanity. He would be up a tree either way. Sarah decided to wait a day or two before going to see the fellow. Then she would sympathize with him. She might even offer to help him dispose safely of his treasure. She picked up a vial of French perfume from her dressing table, another gift of the senator. She liked its smell. She would like to be able to purchase more of the stuff. Bannock, as usual, had scanned the competing papers, so he saw the letter before Joshua did. When the emperor dropped in on his morning rounds, Bannock drew him into his office. Now, I don't want to upset you, Your Excellency, but you're bound to see this or hear about it. There's a letter on the second page of the Alta. He passed the paper across. Joshua read the notice with care, then went over it a second time. He folded the paper and placed it on Bannock's desk. Oh, well, there are always evil-minded detractors about. This cowardly bastard won't even use his real name. What is one to do? You're not angry? One must exercise Christian charity toward cowardly bastards. Speaking of which, I have been considering a proclamation to combine the world's major religions into one. What do you think? Bannock smiled. That's a bit over my head, I'm afraid. Would you like to write a letter in response to this? It's always good for circulation when we can get a war of letters going. Perhaps later, but that reminds me. You may remember Marina, our famous chanteuse, now residing in Missouri. I have received a pleasant letter from her. Of course, the date is a month ago. It seems she is quite a success. She had planned to travel on to Washington, but now she means to remain a while where she is. Her singing is much in demand in Springfield and St. Joseph. That's wonderful. I shall make a note for an item in the bulletin. Perhaps you will allow me to read the letter. No, I think it's a bit personal. However, I may add that it appears Marina has discovered a beau. He is a violinist and they perform together. She tells me they plan to travel when he is discharged. Why, that's even finer news. Discharged, you say? Then this fellow is in the army. Yes, a corporal, I understand. Perhaps I should write to General Fremont and order his promotion. Couldn't do any harm. Buxby arose and scooped up some papers. Now, if you'll excuse me, Your Excellency, I must get back to work. When Joshua left the building, he passed a blue-suited policeman. He was gratified at the man's formal salute. Later that week, Sarah did meet with Joshua, but in circumstances she would not have expected. She had sent him a note requesting an appointment. He had responded with his own note, this with an address and time for the next afternoon, a Sunday. She did not recognize the address, but showed up at the designated place. It was a large house on Octavia Street. There were several other people entering the gate ahead of her. Sarah wondered if the emperor had lured her into another lecture. Then she saw the woman greeting new arrivals at the front door and nearly turned back. It was that Mary Ellen person. Yet Sarah's curiosity got the better of her. She forged ahead and acknowledged her host's greeting with a grim smile. Joshua rose from an armchair when she entered the parlor. He made a sweeping bow. My good friend, Miss Hill, I'm so happy you could make it. He was wearing the same resplendent, though threadbare, uniform she had last seen him in. The pleasure is mine. She allowed him to escort her to the chair he had been using. She tried not to think about fleas. She smiled. The other guests appeared to be mostly well-heeled society types, about half a dozen ladies and the same number of gentlemen, seated on various couches, sofas, and chairs. None of them paid any attention to Joshua. A colored maid was serving refreshments to those that wanted. The emperor helped himself to tea and biscuits. Sarah settled back and took some time to survey the parlor and its furnishings. Of course, she had no desire to socialize with this Mary Ellen person, and yet, judging by her home, the woman certainly knew how to make money. The mahogany mantelpiece had obviously come around the horn, unless it was from the Philippines. Sarah decided to remain and hear her out. When everyone was settled in, Mary Ellen strode to the middle of the room and turned in a slow circle, looking each guest in the eye. Finally, she spoke in a firm voice that must have carried to the street. There is a new world coming. What was high will be made low, and the low made high. The crooked will be made straight. She launched into a tirade, her audience listening rapt and still. The gist of it all, as Sarah understood, was that America was in the beginning of a revolution. That is, a revolving, where everything turns upside down. Mary Ellen's speech was laced with biblical references, Shakespeare, and common slang, all delivered with a Nantucket twang. Sarah felt like leaping up and shouting, Hallelujah, but she restrained herself. She kept waiting for the pitch for money, but it didn't come. The woman talked without pause for half an hour and then abruptly stopped. She said, Thank you all for coming today. Please stay and enjoy the refreshments. I'll be happy to answer questions. There was no applause. No one got up to leave. The room broke up into small conversations in subdued tones that carried a sense of urgency and worry. Sarah looked to Norton. She approached him before anyone else had the chance. Perhaps you could explain the point of all this, Your Highness. I expected her to ask for donations. Why are all these people here? Joshua peered at her over the ferrule of his walking stick. Underground Railroad. Mary Ellen finds jobs for escaped slaves. A lot of them work as servants in good homes. That's what draws folks to these little gatherings. They want to help, either by hiring the runaways or finding someone who will. Sarah peered at Mary Ellen, who was in deep conversation with several others across the room. And she does this why? Out of purely unselfish humanitarian motives? For the most part. Then again, I've been told on good authority that some of the ex-slaves she helps have repaid her by listening in on their employers' talk. They bring Mary Ellen all sorts of business tips, what firms are prospering or about to go under, that sort of thing. She does quite well with her investments, I understand. I thought it would be something of the sort. She owns a string of laundries and boarding houses, does she not? Yes, among other things. She's well connected. Everybody knows everybody. Sarah accepted a glass of port from the maid. Are you asked me, and you asked me to meet you here? Why? Joshua smiled. Not necessarily to hire a servant. As a matter of fact, it was she who suggested you might like to meet her. She mentioned she might be able to help with your difficulties with Senator Sharon. What? How would she have got wind of that? She had never discussed that problem with Joshua. Joshua shrugged. Servants will talk among themselves. Of course, I have no idea to what difficulties she's referring. Something clicked in the back of Sarah's mind. Is it true what they say about Mary Ellen being a voodoo priestess? Oh, yes, that's quite true. Joshua grinned. She was an associate of Madame Laveau in New Orleans. Chapter 7. In October, the telegraph line finally saw completion, running all the way from St. Joseph to Sacramento, with a relay line running under the bay to San Francisco. The last Pony Express rider dismounted and drew his final pay. The service had been losing money anyway. The lean, daring riders were replaced by men wearing sleeve garters and eye shades, tapping away all day and night in the back rooms of the Pacific Telegraph Company. In Missouri, there were still no major battles, though news of the front further east was horrifying. Marina and Randall continued to perform, traveling about the state with the permission of Randall's officers. Several times they appeared before audiences that included General Fremont. Still, Randall had to report back to his unit in Springfield after each trip. He was assigned to put down his fiddle and pick up a rifle, leading his squad on patrol through the green and pleasant countryside, where leaves were turning to autumn brown. Elsewhere, there were stories of rebel bushwhackers lying in ambush, most often up near Kansas. Marina, when she heard of the telegraph, took the first chance she found to send a telegram. She walked down to the office near the railroad station, where a clerk instructed her on how to fill out a telegraph form, printing in block letters and counting words. The fee was much cheaper than Pony Express. She felt happy, and happier still that she could share with someone halfway across the continent. There was no doubt about which friend would receive her first wire message. Dearest Emperor Norton, stop. I hope this finds you well. Stop. Randall and I still happy. Stop. Hope you get to meet him soon. Stop. This my first telegram. Stop. More important news to come, but must first tell Randall. Love, Marina. Stop. She took her time composing the message with some help from the clerk. She had to remind herself that other people would read it, at least two telegraphers, and who knew how many clerks. Several times she crossed out what she had written and started over. With a glance at the clerk on the other side of the counter, she crumpled the rejects and stuffed them into a pocket, blushing. At last, she handed across the final version, along with a few coins for the transmission fee. The clerk counted out the words and gave her change. Marina turned to go. Her mind still struggled to grasp the fact that shortly her words would fly across the land at the speed of lightning. The emperor would read them this very day. Truly, the future was coming at full gallop. Meanwhile, there was still the war. Randall was busy this week with his military duties. It seemed the army could hardly spare him. Marina walked past the newspaper office with the latest bulletins posted outside. There was something about McLellan using balloons to spy on the Rebs. What next, she wondered. The future came with a rush. She passed the police station, now manned by Union Army soldiers. Missouri was still under martial law. Outside that building were wanted posters with the names of known bushwhackers, such as Frank and Jesse James. She hoped those men would stay away from Springfield. Finally, she came to her objective, the Army Hospital. She had come to know some of the patients, the men recuperating before they could be sent back to the war. Others did not stay long. The amputees sent home as soon as possible. Others destined for the cemetery. She often stopped in just to sing a song or two, a cappella, unless someone could accompany with mouth organ or even banjo. The soldiers always cheered her. She stepped through the front door. Today it was cool inside, though not yet cold enough for the potbelly stove. One of the white-coated doctors stepped over to her. "There's a man here been asking after you," he said. "Oh," she smiled, always glad of an admirer. The thought crossed her mind that whoever this might be, she would tell the man about her telegram. "Which one is it?" The doctor pointed with his bearded chin. "Down there on the end, at your left. He came in this morning." The man's face was half covered by bandages. When she reached him, he turned his head and spoke. "Hello, Marina. I'm sure glad to see you." "Randall," she said. She fell to her knees. Later, she took the doctor aside, out on the hospital's front porch. She realized his beard made him look older, probably the main reason he wore it. He might have been about her own age. "He's a lucky fellow," the doctor said. "His face isn't as bad as the bandages make it look. No doubt he'll have a scar, but he's not missing anything important, like an eye or a nose. I've seen much worse come in here. The only thing that worries us is the chest wound. It was a bayonet, you see. He has a broken rib, but it appears his lung was not punctured. He should recover fully as long as septicemia doesn't set in. Of course, he did lose a great deal of blood, which is why he's so weak." "A bayonet, did you say? How frightful. He told me he doesn't remember much about what happened. His squad was ambushed."
"Indeed, rebel bushwhackers. They killed 5 of his squad before being driven off. That was yesterday evening. It happened very fast, I hear. The survivors brought Randall in with a stretcher. He was not conscious."
"I'm glad I happened to come by here. We talked, but then he said he was sleepy, so I left him. He did make one request of me. He asked me to bring his fiddle from the camp."
"I doubt he'll be able to play it for a while, but I'm sure he will be happy to have it. Here, I'll write a note for you to take this to his officer."
He went back inside to the small writing desk near the door, took out pen and ink, and scrawled a short note on foolscap. Marina thanked him and made her way back to her room. She did not answer her host's call for supper. She lay down, fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling. Next morning, she begged a ride on an army supply wagon headed for the camp a mile or so outside of town. She showed her note to a young lieutenant who went to Randall's tent and fetched the instrument for her.
He's a nice boy and a good soldier. We all like hearing his music in the evening. I shall pray for him.
She thanked him and turned away, but he stopped her a moment.
Miss Marina, we enjoy your singing as well. I hope you will return and sing some more.
She nodded, unable to think of words. The lieutenant made a vague gesture toward the tents behind him.
These men, a lot of them are just boys, farm boys. They miss their mothers. I hope you will come back soon.
She nodded, trying not to weep. She found her voice to say, "Yeah, I promise." Then she turned away once more. She chose to walk back to town, though she supposed she could have begged a ride. It was still early. She guessed it would not do to arrive at the hospital too soon, since Randall would want to sleep. By the time she reached town, she had found her appetites. Later that day, she did go to see Randall and gave him the violin. He took it from the case, stroked it with his hands, and then replaced it, making no attempt to play. He smiled at her from behind his bandages, but he seemed weaker. The doctor said,
He's a bit feverish today, but that's to be expected. Part of the healing, you see.
She went to him every day for a week. Amanda's maid, Julia, was concerned, constantly urging Marina to eat when she wasn't hungry.
I can see y'all's hurting bad, she said one day. How come y'all never cry?
Marina stared. The question had never occurred to her. "I don't know, Julia. I guess maybe there's too much work to do." Randall lingered for several days. On Sunday morning, Marina went to church, though she did not make a habit of it. In the afternoon, she went down to the hospital again. Randall's cot was empty. The doctor found her standing at its foot in silence, her face white. He took both her hands.
I brought
I brought some flowers, she said. "You could give them to someone else." The doctor started to speak. She looked in his eyes. "I won't weep. There's too much work to be done." Then she began to cry. The doctor said,
He told me to give you his fiddle.
She did keep her promise to Randall's officer. A week later, she went back to camp. The officers expected her. They arranged a small recital in the evening. The first song she sang was "Hard Times Come Again No More." That was the last time she performed in Missouri. She continued working at the hospital, not knowing what else to do. Often, when alone, she would take out Randall's fiddle and caress it. She'd had a few violin lessons in the past, and Randall had allowed her to try it several times. She found she could play at least well enough to find the scales. One morning before breakfast, she arose, tuned the instrument, and began to play. She played Hard Times, slowly, and she thought badly. When she turned, she found Julia standing in the doorway. Julia began to clap. It was at that moment that Marina knew what she must do.